In this section, we're going to take a look at all the different kinds of grouping symbols you may encounter in your journey through algebra. Let's simplify. Now, first of all, notice that we have a couple of different grouping symbols in this particular expression. We have the parentheses, which we're all familiar with, and in this one we also have brackets. Now, the only reason for using parentheses versus brackets is that you can easily identify which two grouping symbols are paired together. For instance, if these were both sets of parentheses, it might be more difficult to decide whether these were together, these, who knows. So because we're using brackets and parentheses, it's easy to identify that these two grouping symbols match and these two grouping symbols match. Now, when working with an expression that contains more than one grouping symbol, we're going to start with the innermost grouping symbol to simplify. So let's look inside. Here, we see this -2 in front of the x plus y. Does that remind you of something we've seen in the past? Hopefully you're thinking about the distributive property. So what we're going to do, and this is important to rewrite the rest of the problem just as is so you make no mistakes. So we'll rewrite the 3 and our grouping symbol, which happens to be a bracket, 6, and we're going to distribute this -2. We're going to multiply -2 times x, which is -2x, and then we're going to multiply -2 times y for a product of -2y. Now let's look inside our brackets to see if we have any like terms. Nope, they're all different, so we can't combine any like terms in this case. So now what we're going to do is go outside our grouping symbol and we see the 3. What we're going to do at this point then is to multiply the 3 times all these 3 terms within our grouping symbols, just as if they were the parentheses which you're used to. So again, we're going to use our distributive property. 3 times 6, 18. 3 times -2x is -6x. 3 times -2y is -6y. Again, just make a quick check to make sure you have no like terms. In this case, they're all 3 different, so there's nothing we can combine. So our final solution to this expression is 18 minus 6x minus 6y. Let's try another problem involving these grouping symbols. Let's look at this next expression. We're going to simplify 3ab minus bracket 2ab minus parentheses 2 minus a n parenthesis n bracket. Now because we're using these different grouping symbols, again, we can identify which two make a pair. Obviously those parentheses is one set and the brackets make up our second set. When simplifying an expression with all these grouping symbols, again, we start from the inside and work our way out. So what we're going to do, even though it takes you perhaps 5 or 10 seconds longer, we're going to first of all recopy this outside portion because nothing changes here with the 3ab. Then we have the minus sign, and then we have our first bracket. Now in the innermost parentheses here, we see we have a negative sign in front of the parentheses. So hopefully you remember that that negative sign is like having a -1 out front. We're going to again apply the distributive property. So we leave the 2ab, which is not changed. So notice in this first portion, nothing's changed, exactly the same. And now we're going to distribute the -1 into the set of parentheses. So -1 times +2 is -2. -1, and notice that's a -a, so I have 2 negative signs. That gives me a +a. Now we look inside our brackets and check, do we have any like terms? 2ab, -2a. No, they're all different, so there's nothing for us to combine. So we're going to work our way outside these parentheses. Again, we look outside here and we see a negative sign. That's as if we had a -1 there. So again, we're going to apply the distributive property. One more time, write that 3ab out front. And then we'll go ahead and distribute the -1. -1 times +2ab is -2ab. Then we have negative 1, and be careful of the signs here. That's where most errors occur. Be careful with your signs. Negative 1 times negative 2 give us positive 2. And finally, we have negative 1 times positive a, which give us negative a. Again, if you like, that's called the extended distributive property. Now let's check our next line and see, do we have any like terms? 3ab minus 2ab. Right up front here, we have two like terms. Remember, like terms are where the variable portions are exactly the same. So we're going to combine the two numerical coefficients, 3 minus 2, which is 1. Now you can either write it as 1ab, or we're at the point where we can just write it as ab and recognize that 1ab is the same as ab. Then notice we have a 2 and a minus a. They're not like terms, so we'll just write them down. Plus 2 minus a. Don't be tempted to combine these two terms. This is ab and this is a. They look similar, but they're not exactly the same, so we cannot combine those two. So our final simplification of this expression is ab plus 2 minus a. Let's look at a more complex problem. Let's simplify this very long expression. We have 3 brackets, 4x minus 2 parentheses, 1 minus x, n parentheses, n bracket, minus, this subtraction sign is important, it separates these two terms, 3x plus parentheses x minus 2. Now I know you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed at the length of this problem, but we're going to take it nice and slow, and you'll see that if you work step by step, it's not as difficult as it appears at first. Again, we're going to follow the same rules of these grouping symbols. We're going to work on the innermost grouping symbols. In this case, we see some parentheses. So again, we're going to rewrite everything that comes before it, 3 bracket, 4x. Now, we have a negative 2 in front of the parentheses, which we're going to use, again, the distributive property. So we're going to multiply negative 2 times 1, which is negative 2, and negative 2 times a negative x, which gives us a positive 2x. Now, be very careful with your signs. Let's check to make sure we didn't make a mistake. Negative times a positive gives us that negative 2. A negative 2 times a negative x gives us a positive 2x. Now let's continue. Let's look at our second set of grouping symbols here. We see here we have a minus sign between them. And inside we have the innermost grouping symbols, the x plus 2, or excuse me, x minus 2. But in this case, notice there's no number, positive, negative, nothing, in front of the parentheses there. So what that means is we can just take those parentheses off, or if you want, you can think that there's a negative 1 out, or excuse me, a positive 1 out front, and just multiply through. 1 times anything is still anything. So that gives me 3x plus x minus 2. So in other words, the grouping symbols just come off here because we're not multiplying, we're not distributing any number in front. Let's start again from the left, and we'll use this procedure. We start from the left, and we'll keep working our way towards the right. Now let's look inside of our grouping symbols still. Do we have any like terms that we can combine? I see a 4x and a 2x. Those are certainly like terms, so let's combine them. Again, rewrite that 3 on the outside. Put in your bracket, 4x plus 2x, 6x. And then just add the negative 2 there. So notice we just combined like terms within those brackets, and we're getting a little more simpler. Let's look at our second set of brackets. Do we have any like terms? Right up front, I see a 3x and an x. So I'm going to combine those two terms, 3x plus x, 4x, 4x, and then I have a minus 2 right behind it. So far, so good? Let's continue. Now I can finally use this 3 that I've been rewriting over and over, and I'm going to use the distributive property for this 3 onto these brackets here. Remember that brackets are the same as parentheses, so we're going to use them in that fashion. 3 times 6x, 18x, 3, and be careful with the signs, times negative 2, give us a negative 6. That was the distributive property. One more time, we should be experts by now. We've got negative 1 out front. Again, applying the distributive property and being careful with our signs. It's negative 1 times positive 4x, or negative 4x. Negative 1 times a negative 2 gives me a product of positive 2. And we're done with that. Finally, we get to the point where we've got rid of all those grouping symbols, and now we're ready to collect like terms. I see an 18x here, a negative 4x, 18x minus 4x gives me 14x. And finally, all that's left is negative 6 and positive 2, which give me negative 4. So after all this work, this entire expression simplified all the way down to 14x minus 4. Just remember, work from the inside of the parentheses, take it step by step, and be careful of your signs.